Good morning, everyone, again. Uh, Question is, what's a headline? Does a headline have to be in a newspaper? Does a headline, can it be on a website? And really, the impetus for this discussion about Shabbat observance came from two different places. One was an article which we'll be referencing in the sources, and the other was kind of a blurb in a newsletter, the E-Jewish Philanthropy Daily Fill. You get it, your daily fill with a PH, philanthropy, very punny, I guess. And this was led to an exploration. So what was the headline? So source number one: Michael Shapira, a junior satellite beach high school in Florida, receives an award last weekend at the Chabad Youth Movement C-Teens International Summit in New York City, which honored him for withdrawing from a swimming competition because it conflicted with Shabbat. I trained 5 years for that race, Shapira said in a video that was shown at the conference, but this isn't about what I want, it's about who I am. So this was a nice declaration of commitment to Shabbat on the part of a teenager. I don't know if anyone was following the news. This C-Teen International Summit that takes place in New York City, every year they have a Havdalah in Times Square. They had 5,000 teens and Jewish music and the like. Very cool. And anyone finds themselves near Times Square next winter when they do this. But it started, the thought processes in terms of, this was done. And truth is, if you start looking around for articles and other information on the subject, it was found as part of the highlights for what Chabad was doing, but there were no articles written about specifically these teens. It was kind of just a blurb about an announcement about an award being given for their commitment to Shabbat. But it brings to mind others, other episodes in recent memory. We can go back further in terms of what happens when Shabbat observance and one's activities collide. A couple of years ago, there was a teenager who played, I think, table tennis or ping pong. I don't know. I don't want to offend anyone who plays one or the other, but she was a Jewish high school student and could have gone to the Olympic team, but she wanted to play ping pong. It was whole, what's wrong with ping pong on Shabbos? So we're not necessarily going to tackle all the halachic issues, but it got me thinking in terms of the idea of encouraging Shabbat observance. Right? This week's parsha begins about Moshe gathering the Jewish people, and the first thing he tells them as they begin the construction project of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, is you have to keep Shabbat. That is where it all begins. The famous juxtaposition of Shabbat with the Mishkan is so that we know that you're not able to build the Mishkan on Shabbos. So this is the idea, right? It says 6 days you should work, in the seventh you should rest. And then famously says, Lo tevaru eish b'chol moshvosechem b'yom haShabbos. No fire on Shabbos. So why the juxtaposition? Because you can't build the Mishkan, even though it's essential. You can't violate Shabbos. Shabbos takes precedence. Of course, the laws of Shabbat are myriad and complex. This is just a few statements, a few psukim, which encapsulates all of those 39 categories of work. But Shabbos is very much at the heart of who we are as Jews, hence the image related to the class. More than the Jews have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews. We're familiar with that Achad Ha'am declaration, and some people may be familiar with Mordechai ben David's Just One Shabbos song. You're welcome if I put it in your heads. The idea of Shabbos is central, right? So we call observant Jews Shomer Shabbos Jews, even though there are lots of other rules and regulations like kosher and tzedakah and not speaking lashon hara, but observance is sometimes associated with Shabbat. And so this award given to Michael and the other teens was a way of highlighting how we are encouraging people to make the choice of Shabbat over whatever the other activity is, whether it's work or whether it's leisure and the like. And, we've seen this, come up at different times, obviously. So those of a certain age, Sandy Koufax, not pitching on Yom Kippur, he did pitch on Shabbos. But the idea of how was this how is this addressed communally? I thought was an interesting question. Here, we're highlighting the decision of those who decided not to violate Shabbos, and we're awarding them for their choice. Kol hakavod. But if we go back, how was this, understood? Especially, we're reading, as we read every year of the experience of the Jewish people through the desert. We read about the man, and they had double portion on Friday, so they wouldn't collect on Shabbos. What can we learn from our history or other episodes where Shabbos observance needed to be encouraged? We look through the books of the prophets. We see time and time again the prophets railing against the Jewish people for their non-observance. Often this is about non-observance because they're worshiping idols, or it's non-observance and that they're treating others, disrespectfully. For the prophets of Yirmiyahu and Yeshaya, we talk about God doesn't want our fast days. God wants us to do the right thing. Very famously, the Haftorah on Yom Kippur talks about that and concludes, actually, after that conversation, that it's not only about fast days, it's also about behavior. But it then concludes with, keep Shabbos. So again, this idea that Shabbos is essential. So did the Jews keep Shabbos? And what kind of what kind of evidence do we have of encouraging that Shabbos observance or to counter the non-observance? So there is an article that we'll quote a little from in a couple of sources that highlights that this came up, and this is addressed in one of the biblical books. It's addressed in Sefer Nechemiah. Right, Nechemiah is not really, he's not one of the prophets. The book of Nechemiah is in the books of the Ketuvim. And Nechemiah, the Sefer Nechemiah, sometimes connected with Ezra and Nechemiah. But Nechemiah is writing, this memoir essentially is the beginning of the Second Temple period, right? We just celebrated Purim, which is also in that era as well. And Nechemiah is one of the leaders of the Jewish people in this Persian empire. There are those who associate him with, Nechemiah is Mordechai, the rabbis say. And he's writing in this period as the Jews are going back to, remember the King Cyrus has allowed the Jews to go back. Not all of them want to go back. Many of them stay behind. The building process is interrupted by some of the successor kings of the Persian Empire. This is the historical backdrop of the Purim story. But we're going to take a look at what's happening with the Jews in country. Nehemiah, we may have discussed previously, also is the source of one of the descriptions of Rosh Hashanah being celebrated by the Jews. I may have mentioned before this idea that seeing the Jews celebrate in the biblical period, how they celebrate Judaism is fascinating. What was their Rosh Hashanah like? So we have a taste of what their Rosh Hashanah was like, also being discussed by Nehemiah and Ezra. And so here we have a selection from the book of Nehemiah, source number 2, from chapters 9, 10, and 13, describing the Jewish people living in the land of Israel, those who went back, and it describes what was going on. It describes what they were experiencing. It describes their building. It describes their community, and within the context of describing the Jewish acceptance of Torah and mitzvot, so Nehemiah says, "As Shabbos right, describing God, you've made known to them your holy Sabbath, and you ordained for them laws, commandments, and teachings through Moses your servant. But let's face it, throughout history, the Jews have not always been the most observant. You stiffened their necks and did not obey your commandments." So it continues several verses later. We're guilty. We have not followed the Torah. And we have ignored those commandments and those testimonies. And what's been the result? Right, we are slaves. The land that you gave our ancestors to enjoy its fruit and bounty, here we are slaves on it. We're not in control of our own destiny. Right? Even with that's very famously the expression when we celebrate Purim for the Jews being saved, they were not free. We say the question then is, why don't we say Hallel on Purim? And one of the answers given is because Achashverosh is still in charge. So moving into chapter 10, nevertheless, we're still committed as Jews, even though we're not in control of our destiny, even though we're slaves. We're here. We make this pledge and put it in writing, and on the sealed copy are subscribed our officials, our Levites, and our priests. We're signing on the dotted line that we are still connected to God. And chapter 10 then has a list of all of the Kohanim and Leviim and officials who were part of this. There's a whole list of those officials in chapter 10. And so this can be seen as kind of Nechemiah giving kind of a recap of where the Jews are historically. We were Jews, we sinned, we're servants, but we're still here and we're still committed. And then in describing the state of the Jews in later on, in chapter 13, so Nechemiah describes what's happening. By Yamim Ahema, Ra'isi Yehuda Dorchim Gitos Bashabas. Usharham. Go back to the end of chapter 10. Sorry, 29 to 32. Usharham Akohanim Avim Ashorim Ashorim Nesinim Chol Anidam Me'amei Aretz El Torah Sel Him Shem Neim Nenosim Chol Yodei Mevin Machzikim Alachehem Adirim Avayim Balov Mishvol Aleches Besoras Elokim. Right? Here, we the Jewish officials, we're signing on the dotted line, and everybody else. We are committed to following God's laws. The Amei Haaretz Hamaviyim Es Hamichachos V'Chol Shever B'Yom HaShabbos L'Mkor Lo Nikach Me'em HaShabbos V'Yom HaKodesh V'Nitoshes HaShana HaShvis U'Masa Chol Yad. In the bolded final verse in the Hebrew and at the end of the English paragraph, we're saying that we're going to not buy from those people who are selling on Shabbos. Part of the populist's commitment is, that the leaders are citing, we're going to enforce the law, and the people are saying, we're going to observe Shabbos. So it seems that Shabbos is standing out as part of this episode with Nechemiah and the Jewish people, and they see themselves at a time, and we're talking, essentially in the 5th century BCE, that before, as the Second Temple is being rebuilt, that part of that commitment is going to be about Shabbos. And it continues by mentioning that we saw at this time that what was taking place, people were treading in the wine presses on the Sabbath, and people were bringing heaps of grain and loading up the donkeys on Shabbos, and they're bringing it into Jerusalem on Shabbos. And Nechemiah says, and this is in the final paragraph, 15 to 22 in chapter 13, I admonish them there and then for selling provisions. You can't sell on Shabbos. Close the stores, right? It's kind of, foreshadowing, what we hear about in the shtetl, someone going through before Shabbos telling everybody, you didn't close the stores. I admonish them there and then for selling provisions. Tyrians who lived there bought fish, all sorts of wares, and sold them on the Sabbath to the Judahites in Jerusalem. Right? What would happen? Well, guess what? The Jews closed their stores, but non-Jews didn't have to work on Shabbos. Could work on Shabbos. V'hatzorim. They went, and they would sell them to the Bnei Yehuda of Yerushalayim. You can't go to the Jewish stores, so the Jews would shop at the non-Jewish stores. I censure the nobles of Judah, saying to them, what evil thing is this that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? What are you doing? You can't buy from the non-Jews on Shabbos. This is just what your ancestors did. And for it, God brought all this misfortune on the city. And now you give cause for further wrath against us for profaning the Sabbath. We're trying to recreate a second commonwealth here. And we're recommitting ourselves. And the Kohanim and the Leviim, and we're all here committing to doing the best we can to observe God's laws. You got to be closed on Shabbos. And you got to stop working anything on Shabbos. You can't even have the non-Jews do it for you. When shadows filled the gateways of Jerusalem at the approach of the Sabbath, I gave orders that the doors be closed in order them not to be opened until after the Sabbath. Nechemiah takes matters into his own hand, close the gates, lock the gates. I stationed some of my servants at the gates so that no goods would enter on the Sabbath. Right? If you can't trust the Jews, you have to enforce it. Once or twice, the merchants and the vendors of all sorts of wares spent the night outside Jerusalem. Right? So the doors are closed, so the people are outside. And he's saying that they're waiting outside, hoping that they could find a way in, hoping that they can get in immediately after Shabbos. But I warn them, what do you mean by spending the night alongside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands upon you. No, we don't want you nearby. We don't want this commercial activity proximate to the Jews. From then on, they did not come on the Sabbath. I gave orders to the Levites to purify themselves and come around, guard the gates, preserve the sanctity of the Sabbath. This too, oh my God, remember to my credit and spare me in accord with your abundant faithfulness. Right? Nechemiah sees this as a holy battle for the soul of the Jewish people for the observance of Shabbat. And so this emphasis on encouraging Shabbat observance, reminding the Jewish people of their aspirational nature of observing commandments. And if they're not willing to do so, well, they have to enforce it. And you enforce it, and they have to close their stores, and you have to shut down any type of commerce, whatever it's going to take. You put the guards at the gate. And Nechemiah sees this as a religious good. The idea that Shabbat has to be observed, and Shabbat has to be encouraged, and you have to take the steps that are necessary. He was in a position to take, formal steps to enforce, and so it was. We read in the book of Ezra, when reading about some of the various officials, we find an official in source number 3, Ach Yonatan ben Asael v'Yachzia ben Tikva Amdu al Zos u'Mishulam v'Shabtai Halevi Azaru. Shabtai the Levi supported them. Now, Shabtai is a Jewish name. I don't know if anyone knows any Shabtais or the like, but the name Shabtai, Professor Tova Ganzel, in the article that I mentioned before, mentions in source number 4, it's unclear what the name Shabtai means. It's possible that it means born on Shabbat. Alternatively, the name may mark a broader significance associated with Shabbat, not necessarily tied to the individual's birthday. Right? Shabtai, Shabbos was a theme for the Jewish people in this era, so they took the name Shabtai. It's kind of, when we look at some of the biblical names, it's confusing that we have so many biblical names, all of those Nisim and all of those individuals those are names we don't use anymore. Or even of the Shoftim, the judges, we don't really always use the names because it all depends what we're naming after relatives, right? Certain names seem to lose favor. Or for example, we have a Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Rabbi Yishmael is in the Talmud. Yishmael is part of the liturgy every morning. Now, who's Yishmael? Yishmael is Avram's son from Hagar. Now, why is that a name? Somehow it gained in popularity. It does mean God should listen, so it has a nice message. But I don't know, anyone here know any Yishmaels? I don't think so. Probably with the rise of Islam, it really lost its cachet. But here we see that Shabtai has cachet. And what's with the cachet? Either way, this name derived from Shabbat is only found during the Persian Achaemenid period. It reflects the emerging importance of Shabbat within Judean identity. Indeed, a similar name derived from Shabbat, Shabbatia, is absent in earlier Assyrian and Babylonian period sources. Ganzel points out that maybe Shabtai, this was the theme. It's kind of, after October 7th, you have people taking names of those who are murdered, or you have people taking names in Amichai. Why? Because my nation lives. This is a good name for this period of time, right? So I don't know. We take names from what's going on around us, and so Ganzel, utilizing Nechemiah 9, 10, 13, looking at the name Shabtai appearing only in the book of Ezra. And also, and you can look at the article for more details, identifying historical evidence and the historical names and the idea of the concept of Shabbat as a sacred day being something that's unique to the Jews, as well as the fact that the name Shabtai appears only in this period when Shabbos is being elevated as a cause célèbre by Nechemiah. So maybe this is that first effort to encouraging Shabbat observance. It became a motif. It became something significant. It became something that was relevant in terms of encouraging Shabbat observance culturally, religiously, and even naming our kid Shabtai in connection. I don't know, Hirsch, if your grandson was born on Shabbos, or what was the origins, or why the name was chosen. Have anything to do with Shabbos, or they just like the name? In any event, the idea of Shabbos, here we have, maybe the first Shabbos campaign, that is undertaken by the Jews, and similarly is part of what the undertaking Shabbos campaigns, foreshadowing Shabbos campaigns of the future. Wanted to look at some of those Shabbos campaigns because let's face it, for the most part, similar to this biblical period, the Jews either had a choice: you were either part of the Jewish community and you observed, or you were outside of the community. And we've spoken about non-observance and how that's viewed communally and the like. But we have from a community-wide perspective in terms of Shabbos being something under siege as a communal value, really requires. We're going to fast forward into the modern era, right? In the modern era, in certainly the beginning of 19th century in Central and Western Europe, as the values of the Enlightenment become entrenched, as Jews gain some emancipation and independence to become part of the communities in places, Germany, Prussia, these areas, it becomes something that is more, becomes more opportunity. Then we begin to see some of those reforms that become formalized and known as the Reform movement. We see changes to the synagogue to be more like everybody else. One of the initial changes that they started doing in some of the synagogues in Germany, they had family seating. One of the big innovations of the time that they felt was decorum.
Right.
Jews talk too much in shul. So they wanted it to be quiet in shul. I still remember.
Okay, thank you.
I still remember a reference of I think it was in a Herman Wouk novel where they talk about they're talking about casinos, and he's like, yeah, casinos, in Monaco are just like Reformed temples. They're quiet. It's not like Las Vegas. But so just the cultural reference of Jews being quiet was a Reform concept. That was in the 19th century. That was a reform. But there was also this idea that Shabbos, the Sabbath, everyone else is observing the Sabbath on Sunday. How about us? And so that emerged in first half of the 19th century in Germany. But it comes across to the ocean in the United States as well. And one of those discussions, as reform begins to become a movement in America, also some of those similar things, how much observance, how much ritual, this shape of the synagogue, things of that sort. And among the rituals being discussed for their relevance, it becomes Shabbos. And as reform starts as a movement, really as a movement, it kind of breaks into its own. Very famously, they set up a rabbinical school, Hebrew Union College, and at their first graduation, they were going to have a celebration. And this was meant to be a very special moment for American Jews, and all of the different religious leaders, Jewish leaders, were invited to participate in the dinner to celebrate the graduation. And the invitation said, dietary laws observed, and everyone sits down. The first course was shrimp cocktail. Right, I'm not sure whose dietary laws are being observed, but that's what it was. And this treifa banquet, as it's called, could very well be what set off America as the treifa Medina. Right, it gets referred to as the non-kosher, the country. That was the tone that gets set, but it's clear that there's going to be a different type of communal Judaism within America. There's still the traditional, but there's the non-traditional. And that develops to the founding of a reform movement that famously coalesces around what's called the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885. And so, the reform as a centralized movement recognizes things have changed. We're no longer seeking redemption. The role of the Jews has changed. We still believe in God. We still believe we have to live in this Mosaic inspiration. But ritual starts falling by the wayside. One of the rituals that's under assault is Shabbat. The observance of the don'ts, the negative commandments of Shabbat, certainly, but even the idea like, why not celebrate Shabbat on Sunday? And this becomes a very big machlokes rishonim, dispute among the earlier Reform rabbis. There were those Reform rabbis who thought this was sacrilege. How can you move Shabbat, the Sabbath, to Sunday? We're still Jews. And others felt, wait a second, you're changing everything else. if we're not interested in the rules, so move it to Sunday. It's kind of, as I often summarize, that at its core, Reform Judaism is about Judaism as a choice. So you could choose whatever you want. I often illustrate that with the Reform rabbi at Yale University, who was the chaplain and was known for having a bit of more of an observant lifestyle. So his kids went to day school, and he kept kosher, and his wife was on the board of the local mikveh. And they would say, are you a Reform rabbi? He would say, yes, I'm Reform. Reform says you can choose how you want to live Jewishly, and I choose to live Orthodox. So, it's all a choice. So if everything is a choice, then that becomes a choice. And in some ways, though, that if everything's a choice and you're looking to care about Shabbos, as Jenna Weissman-Johnson, the American Jewish historian, notes, in 1880, for instance, only an estimated 1,500 New York Jews out of a population of 75,000 observed Shabbat as it should be. Sorrowfully related the Jewish Messenger, the Jewish periodical of the time. So what's 1,500 of 75,000? It's not very good, right? We're talking 2% of Jews were observing Shabbat. So some felt within the Reform movement, we got to do something about Shabbos. We got to do something about Shabbos, make it accessible. And a major challenge, especially at this time, this was 1880. So this is as the Reform movement is developing as a movement, right? Pittsburgh Platform, 1885, beginning of a Eastern European immigration influx into the U.S. between 1880 and 1920. Several million Jews come in, especially traditionalist Jews. So some decided that the battle for Shabbos is going to be won by changing Shabbos. Others felt is that we have to change how Sabbath is understood. And there became a fight for the Sabbath, right, at this time. Source number 6, the wavering position of Reform leadership could have remained the status quo if not for the intervention by a group of rabbis calling themselves the Jewish Sabbath Alliance, led by Rabbi Bernard Drachman. Rabbi Bernard Drachman was one of the early, modern Orthodox rabbis of the time, and was one of the founders of the OU and one of the rabbis in Manhattan. And so what he would say, how can an American state say to the citizens of Hebrew faith, you must revere and observe the day consecrated to the memorial of the resurrection of the Nazarene? Right? They used kind of fancy language back then. He's like, wait a second, we believe in freedom of religion, but Jews can't observe the Sabbath on their day. They have to observe it on Sunday. Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. This is exactly what it's doing when it compels the observance of Sunday by Jews. He told an audience of Christian clergy in 1915. If this is not religious tyranny, what is? Drachman became president of the Jewish Sabbath Alliance, a cross between a religious organization and a social reform club that advocated for Shabbos as a right. These efforts invariably failed, meeting with opposition from a growing movement of Christian Sabbatarians who pressed for an observance of Sunday Sabbath, not just through church attendance, but by the enforced cessation of work, commerce, and leisure activities like movies and sports. So basically, the Jews are fighting for Shabbos, and the religious Christians are fighting for a more religious observance of their Sabbath on Sunday by closing of commerce and limiting of other types of activities, including enforced cessation of movies and sports. Very from when you think about it. Now, this was, the remnant of which that we still feel, a little bit of this remains today. Is anyone who wants to shop in Bergen County on Sundays, right? The blue laws, and that's what had to do, I think, with the color of the ticket or the sign that enforced the closing of the commerce. But the effort to Rabbi Drachman was trying to elevate Shabbos as, look, let the Jews to have their Shabbos on Saturday, and that will allow them to work on Sunday, and therefore maybe that will raise the prominence. We're not going to change Shabbos. We're going to try and change the environment around Shabbos. And this was up against a much larger movement among religious Christians to elevate their Sabbath on Sunday, which was under assault, and remains so. These days, they play football on Sunday, right? Isn't that? I guess only college football is very religious. They play on Saturday, but otherwise they play on Sunday. But it was also difficult in terms of in terms of, if you have the religious emphasis on Sunday, that's going to make companies loath to antagonize their Christian clients, shoppers, etc. They're not going to close on Sunday, be open on Saturday, provide that economic opportunity for the Sabbath observant Jews. And so it was a campaign that was trying to change, not necessarily encourage the Jews to keep Shabbos, but change society around, and it was not working. As early as 1910, Drachma began to advocate within the organization for an ecumenical two-day Sabbath observed by Jews and Christians alike. Right? We'll do Saturday, you do Sunday, let's have a two-day Sabbath. In 1915, he traveled to the Lord's Day Congress in Oakland, California, International Convention of Christian Sabbatarians. I don't think Sabbatarian is a very popular term in Christianity these days. Made a public address proposing a 5-day week. Now, all of a sudden, 5-day work week, now we're starting to get somewhere. He patiently explained that the timing of the Jewish Sabbath is sacrosanct and non-negotiable. Just as he cannot expect Christian Sabbath observers to return to Saturday, they should respect a smaller but equally valid Jewish tradition. It's a matter of keen regret to us that this difference exists between us and the Christian world with regards to Sabbath. It is not of our making, nor it is in our power to alter it. So there were efforts. There was a recognition the Jews aren't observing Sabbath. Kind of update the images or our understanding of the Nechemiah scenario to what's going on in early 20th century America. And there's something similar. However, the Jews are not in control of the narrative. They can't lock the gates, close the doors, keep the people out and enforce. They're trying to change. And those efforts were coming up against a very unwilling populace. Once the idea of a 5-day work week begins to develop further and the labor unions support that, all of a sudden it picks up more traction. So, by the time you get to post-war America, you have less of that challenge of having to work on Saturday or not, right? The very famous, this kind of, extends the Treifa Medina. It wasn't just the non-observance of the Jewish populace, but it was a country that doesn't lend itself to proper observance. And the choice was show up on Saturday and don't bother coming back on Monday. And this definitely was a challenge. And I think we mentioned before, some of the first hashkama, early morning services on Shabbos morning for those who wanted to daven before going to open up their stores and the like. But that specific challenge, once the 5-day work week did gain traction, not for any religious reasons, more for labor and economic and social reasons, that became more of less of an obstacle to Sabbath observance. What becomes more the obstacle for Sabbath observance is, now with such a leisure culture and those who are less observant, what about the different opportunities that people now have? Almost the same challenges that those Christian Sabbatarians were trying to counter with regards to commerce and entertainment and sports and the like on the Sabbath. That now becomes the biggest challenge. Thinking back to our opening teenager who gave up the swim meet, and that becomes a challenge of how to address that. And so obviously, there were different reactions to try and encourage people to maintain a more Sabbath-centric type of a religion. In the 1950s, the conservative movement permitted driving on Shabbat to go to synagogue. They have a whole article and a whole approach, which is very much in line with how they have historically adjusted halacha, which they feel is compatible with tradition, and it's a separate conversation. But what happens, when you're still faced with a very, other than those who are the committed Orthodox, what about those who are less committed? How do you maintain? How do you encourage a Shabbos atmosphere? So there was an interesting episode in Cincinnati in the middle of the 20th century. In Cincinnati, the Orthodox rabbi was Rabbi Eliezer Silver, who was an Eastern European immigrant to the United States, part of the Agudas Harabanim, part of that really, pre-war and post-war. He was there fighting the good fight for observance before, and then kind of reaping the benefits of the influx and growth of the Orthodox community after it. So he was very well positioned in Cincinnati, which, in addition to WKRP, for those who recognize that cultural reference, is also known for more of a centralized, unified Jewish community at the time. He was a major figure who was respected by all segments of the community. Now, strangely, Cincinnati is the home of the Reform movement. Hebrew Union College, although right now I think they're selling everything and consolidating, and let's just say that whole endeavor is under challenged now. But the question was, the JCC wanted to open up on Shabbos. I figured if people aren't observant, the JCC should be open. And remember, JCCs were very much about the pool for the community. So Rabbi Aaron Rokeved Rothkopf writes in his biography of Rabbi Silver, in 1961, the Cincinnati Jewish Community Center decided to open its facilities on Saturday afternoon. Rabbi Eliezer Silver was consulted by the center's leadership to help plan a program of activity which would be in consonance with the Sabbath. Under his guidance, the center adopted 14 regulations for their Saturday afternoon events. These included, if the showers are used, hot water tanks must be preheated and temperatures kept at no higher than 75 degrees. It's a bit of a cold shower. But the idea is he's being sensitive to, you're not allowed to heat water up on Shabbos. So he didn't want the center to be heating up cold water to be hot on Shabbos. Swimming is permitted, but bathing suits may not be carried to or from the center or wrung out on the Sabbath. The center will supply polyethylene bags. I guess that's what they call plastic then, in which wetsuits can be deposited and be picked up after the Sabbath, right? You want you bringing what you're using in the pool. It has to be there already. And they don't want people squeezing them out. They want them putting them in the bags. The center called attention to the fact they did not have an indoor swimming pool. Its outdoor pool used only in the summer was heated by the atmosphere, right? The idea also being worried about, you don't want to warm up the pool, the mechanism that would then heat up the water on Shabbos. So you see that there was an effort to, look, not everyone is observant, but can we create as much of an atmosphere as possible? An interview with Silver regarding Sabbath programming appeared in Jewish Welfare Board. Silver explained that he agreed with the center's opening under these conditions so that children could spend Saturday afternoons in a Jewish environment. You see, for a long time, I've been thinking that too many Jewish children spend Saturday afternoon in desecrating the Sabbath. They go to all kinds of commercial, recreational places, movies, and other places which are bad for their morals and certainly violate Jewish tradition. Kind of, you can hear a Sabbatarian voice. It was therefore my thought that if the center could be open according to Jewish tradition, our Jewish children could spend Saturday in their Jewish environment, and I had hoped to even get a taste of what the Sabbath really means. I'd like to take this opportunity to emphasize at this time that, in my opinion, it's more important that the center be open on the Sabbath than the other days of the week. You see, on the weekdays, Jewish people, adults as well as children, are busy, have many places to go for their leisure time activities which are not harmful to them. However, on the afternoon of the Sabbath, the JCC of Cincinnati will be the only place where I know with confidence they'll be able to go and have a positive experience in the spirit of the Jewish tradition in a beautiful new center building. I firmly believe that this program is carried out properly will help all of Jewish life in our community. You see, kind of you can't close the gates, and you're not necessarily able to appeal to the outside world to make it more Shabbos friendly, but maybe we can bring in people who are not observing into a more Shabbos friendly environment. And the encouraging of Shabbat observance is coming from that direction. And it seems very much based upon this idea of creating a Shabbos environment. This idea we often encounter with regards to Shabbos. You have the do's and the don'ts. You have the zachor and the shamor. You have the experience and the obligation. Ramban notes that this is really the Shabbat experience is part and parcel of the obligation. It appears to me that this interpretation tends to state that we're commanded by the law of the Torah to have a rest on a festival day, even from activities which are not in the category of melacha. Right? You can't do forbidden activities, but it's also an obligation to engage in something which you enjoy. Enjoying Shabbat is an obligation. But sometimes, what we enjoy, isn't allowed. Sometimes it is. So, very famously, Shulchan Aruch talks about playing ball. One is forbidden to play with the ball on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Okay. Ramah, there are those who permit it, and the people's custom is to be lenient. We see that there's the effort to thread the needle between what's absolutely forbidden and what is permitted, and try and find a way to make it work. And very much, I think, is the motivation behind the Rabbi Silver effort. And it's tricky. Is it appropriate? Right? There's an ancient Hasidic adage, which what you must not do, don't do, and what you're allowed to do, you don't need to do. It might be halachically acceptable to eat kosher bacon, but as my father was wont to say, it's pasnish, right? What is pasnish? Rabbi Silver is saying pasnish is violating Shabbos outside of a JCC environment. Maybe come in, and it's not the activities that you would proactively do, but it's better than the alternative. And maybe we can be hopeful that while it was difficult 2,500 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 60 years ago, Shabbos is still making a comeback. Source number 11 from an article in the OU. From Hollywood to sports to the political sphere, Shabbat is enjoying a moment in popular culture with personalities like Mayim Bialik, Elmara Staudemeyer, Ben Shapiro, and former White House advisor Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump openly publicizing aspects of their observance. Closer to home, October 7 hostages and their families kept Shabbat even in the face of tremendous risk and harrowing tragedy. Since the start of the Swords of Iron War, more than 40,000 Israelis have begun observing Shabbat, according to a recent article. Equally noteworthy is the growing number of Jewish teens drawn to Shabbat, embracing it with courage and independence, regardless of others' opinions. Just exactly, we're ending where we started. Is the resurging interest in Shabbat a passing phase or something more enduring? Good question. But we see that this has been something that has been part and parcel of the Jewish lived experience from very early on and continues. And we continue to try to elevate the experience of Shabbat so that people will enjoy and come to embrace it. And hopefully it will be something which will be more enduring. And that Shabbat is something that has very much kept us connected. There's some truth in Achad's statement, and something that we can continue to encourage, especially on a week when we are reading about Shabbos, reading about Shabbos. Very often this was the time when there was an initiative called Shabbat Across America to try and encourage more people to celebrate. There's the Shabbos Project, the Rabbi Goldstein. There are ways, and this continues to be something which is part of a continuing tradition of encouraging and elevating Shabbos as central in our Jewish experience.